world geopolitics and medicine.
According to a 1975 survey, out of 16,000 licensed physicians in Korea, 4,000 of them were practicing abroad, which was 1/4 of the country's total. The majority of these physicians were in the United States. But Korean medical personnel were also present around the world. In Europe, Japan, and even in Africa and the Middle East. While the brain drain raised a number of issues, Korean medical personnel had multiple roles, one of which was diplomacy. While the Korean government was actively trying to curb the outflow of medical personnel, the government also sending them abroad for a diplomatic and economic reason. One famous example would be nurses in West Germany. 12,000 nurses were dispatched from 1963 to 1976. In return, Germany agreed to provide $30 million loan to Korea. In the case of doctors, there were geopolitical reasons such as the birth of the Third World, represented at the time by the non-aligned movement and the diplomatic rivalry between South and North Korea. Let's take a look at South Korea's diplomatic position in Africa from the 1960s onwards through the activities of Korean doctors. In 1955, the first Asian-Africa Conference was held in Bandung, Indonesia, during the Cold War. The conference, which brought together 29 newly independent Asian and African nations after World War II, formed a new international political grouping that rejected the dichotomies of the Cold War by being anti-colonial, peaceful, and neutral. With the new neutral countries leading the third power, South Korea and North Korea, which were under the influence of the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively, had forged new diplomatic relationships. It was an issue of voting in the United Nations General Assembly that prompted South and North Korea to turn their attention to diplomacy with neutrals. After the ceasefire in Korean War, political talks were held in Geneva in April 1954 to reach a peaceful settlement of the problems on Korean Peninsula, yet without result. The Korean issue was placed on the UN General Assembly's agenda, where it was automatically placed annually, to discuss the annual report of the United Nations Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, the UNCURC, which was tasked with establishing a unified, independent, and democratic government on the entire Korean Peninsula. The communist group, which has opposed the creation of UNCURC from the onset, submitted resolutions calling for the withdrawal of foreign troops from the Korean Peninsula and the disbanding of UNCURC. At the same time, the invitation of the representatives from both South and North Korea to the UN General Assembly, debate on the Korean Peninsula was also subject to a vote. With the Western side submitting resolutions calling for the invitation of a South Korean representative only, the Communist group calling for a North Korean representative only, or for both South and North Korean representatives. Throughout the 1950s, every vote in the UN General Assembly was in favor of the West, and every resolution in favor of the North was voted down. However, after the Bandung Conference in 1955, neutral countries with anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and self-determination rhetorics stopped giving unconditional cooperation to former colonial powers in the UN General Assembly. The impact was seen in January 1957, when South Korea attempted to join the United Nations at a vote of UN's Special Political Committee. The South Korean government has held a nationwide petition throughout 1956, collecting 10 million signatures and submitting them to the UN, with the expectation that it would pass with an overwhelming majority. A vote in the UN's Political Affairs Committee voted to bring South Korea's application to the General Assembly, but the vote was 45 in favor, 8 against, and 22 abstentions, with a large number of abstentions, mainly from neutral countries in Asia and Africa. Beginning in 1957, the South Korean government attempted to shift its policy away from factional diplomacy, which had previously centered its diplomatic activities on the West, or countries friendly to the West, and instead attempted to improve relations with neutral countries. A new diplomatic strategy was required. This was true for North Korea as well. With the internal political turmoil resolved, new diplomatic and economic partnerships outside of Soviet Union and China were necessary. North Korea signed trade agreement with India and Egypt prior to the implementation of its 5-year economic plan in 1957. North Korea's anti-imperialist and national self-determination stance was looked upon favorably by third world countries in the non-aligned movement. The South, which was more concerned with securing votes at the United Nations, struggled to establish substantial diplomatic relations with third world.
Government dispatched doctors.
The South Korea recognized that diplomatic competition against the North in terms of getting neutral countries for votes in the UN General Assembly was inevitable. These were newly independent nations, which were often referred to the Third World, and they were mostly in Africa and Asia. Setting them apart from existing superpowers such as Soviet and the US. But with limited resources, both economically and technologically, it was hard to make visible efforts. North Korea, ahead of South Korea, was actively engaged in aid to friendly countries. In the first half of the 1960s, North Korea's aid to Africa included 200 military instructors, 200 guerrilla instructors, 100 athletic trainers, as well as 68 tractors and 30 bulldozers donated to Somalia in 1961, and various other military and cultural exchanges. In contrast, South Korea's aid to Africa in the first half of the 1960s was almost non-existent. The South Korean side recognized that in order to strengthen its diplomacy in Africa, it was difficult to gain enough support from neutral countries. By simply sending goodwill missions without providing tangible benefits such as direct aid. Then, in October 1962, the South Korean Foreign Ministry received an unexpected offer from the newly independent Uganda government, which had established diplomatic relations with South Korea just before. The Uganda government requested doctors to be sent to newly established diplomatic relations with the other countries because it was unable to secure specialized technical personnel, especially medical doctors, who had returned to their motherland after independence. In a meeting with the Uganda Minister of Health, the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs was asked to send a Korean doctor with the condition that the Uganda government would pay for his travel and stay as well as his remuneration. In effect, it was an opportunity for the Korean government to showcase its medical cooperation at almost no cost for the Korean side. In April 1964, 6 Korean doctors were sent to Africa for the first time. The Korean press reported that it was a demonstration of the development of Korean medicine, and South Korea's new status in the world. In December, 9 more doctors were sent, and by 1975, a total of 61 doctors had been sent and employed in Uganda alone. However, as the Korean press correctly pointed out, rather than being aid, this was an export of human resources. Their salaries and expenses were paid by Uganda. And the South Korean government was simply mediating this export in the middle. This led the South Korean government to recognize that sending medical personnel could be an important tool of diplomacy. The US government had the same opinion. The US State Department was concerned that while many white-collar professionals, including doctors, were being trained through US aid program, South Korea's current economic capacity did not have the market or workplace to absorb those professionals. They argued that if these professionals were unable to find jobs for themselves, they could turn to communism. So it was necessary to actively market them abroad to prevent such a possibility. Between 1964 and 1966, coup in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Dahomey, now Benin, ousted democratically elected president and installed dictatorships. This strengthened the tie with North Korea, which advocated national self-determination. At the same time, the intensification of the Cold War meant that large amounts of aid money was flowing into Africa through the Soviet Union. Friendly talks and technical agreements without substantial handouts became ineffective in real diplomacy. In response, the South Korean government began to provide full-scale medical aid. From 1968, medical cooperation agreements were signed with Dahomey, Gambia, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, and Niger, through which government doctors were officially dispatched. Starting with 3 doctors in Niger, 3 in Liberia, and 2 in Dahomey in 1968, there were 25 government-dispatched doctors and 51 locally employed doctors. A total of 76 doctors in Africa by 1972. The total number of government-dispatched doctors before the transfer of responsibility to the Korean International Cooperation Agency in 1991 was 104. However, this only included those who were hired and paid by the Korean government and did not include those who were employed by local governments, such as in the case of Uganda. Since the 1970s, a large number of medical personnel was sent to Uganda, as well as to Libya and the Middle East, in the form of the employed doctors. So it is estimated that more than 200 doctors were sent for the purpose of medical diplomacy. Doctors were considered to be highly effective for relatively small amounts of aid budget for several reasons. As civilian diplomacy, they were relatively free from political conflict. The provision of medical service made it easier to organize groups in favor of Korea. And most importantly, they were in close and frequent contact with elite members of the host government. The recognition of doctors as a key diplomatic resource was reflected in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs expenditure records. The wages and subsidies of government doctors were paid out from the account under intelligence for diplomatic operations, indicating that government doctors were perceived by government as more than just medical aid to South Korea, but as key intelligence assets.